That unsightly scrap pile was a violation of Covenant 7.4, Mr. Davies. We had it removed for you. You should be thanking us. The voice on the phone was syrupy sweet, but underneath it was a river of pure, unadulterated smugness, the kind of self-satisfaction that only a petty tyrant can truly master. I stood on the concrete pad at the far edge of my 10-acre property, the Montana sky a vast indifferent blue above me. My boots crunched on loose gravel where only yesterday the support anchors for my primary HF antenna array had been bolted down. The air smelled of pine and freshly cut steel. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and rising fury. $150,000. That's what it had cost, not just in materials, the custom-milled aluminum, the miles of LMR 600 coaxial cable, the specialized phasing harnesses, the high-purity copper ground radials that fanned out like a metallic root system just beneath the sod. It was the cost of 6 months of my life, of planning, of fabricating, of climbing towers in the blistering sun and the freezing cold. It was my retirement project, the culmination of a 30-year career in the Army Signal Corps. It was my connection to the world, my way of volunteering for the Emergency Response Network, my passion, and now it was gone. The entire structure, a complex, beautiful sculpture of engineering and physics, had been dismantled, cut up, and hauled away. All that remained were 4 clean, circular cuts in the thick steel tower legs, a few stray bolts, and the deep, angry gouges in the earth where they had dragged the pieces to a waiting truck. "Karen," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the way it got when I was seconds from going critical. "My name is John, and you and I both know my property isn't part of your Whispering Pines HOA. You have illegally entered my land and committed grand larceny." A tinkling, utterly fake laugh came through the phone. "Oh, that's where you're mistaken, Mr. Davies. The preliminary annexation survey clearly includes your parcel. The paperwork is just being finalized. We were simply being proactive in enforcing community standards. That thing was an eyesore and a potential danger." I looked at the perfectly rendered, engineer-stamped blueprints still clutched in my hand, the ones I had just been using to plan the final transceiver interface. An eyesore, my masterpiece. A structure capable of bouncing a signal off the moon. She had called it an unsightly scrap pile. That was the moment the ice in my veins began to boil. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a declaration of war. What this power-drunk HOA president didn't know was that she had just picked a fight with a man who had spent 3 decades planning communication strategy for the United States military. A man who documented everything, and a man who understood that the most effective weapon isn't anger, but meticulously compiled evidence. She thought she had removed a pile of scrap. She had no idea she had just armed a weapon pointed directly at her. This is my story. It's a story about property rights, about bullying, and about the sweet, sweet justice that comes when a petty tyrant finally overreaches and gets what they deserve. If you've ever had your own nightmare with an HOA, or if you just love a story where the little guy fights back and wins, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to hear your stories too. Now let me take you back to how this whole mess started, because this wasn't Karen's first move. It was just her last. The whole thing began 6 months earlier, when my wife, Sarah, and I closed on our dream property. 10 acres of rolling Montana woodland, bordered by a creek on one side and national forest on the other. It was perfect, secluded, quiet, with a clear line of sight to the northern sky. After 30 years of moving wherever the Army sent me, this was going to be our forever home. We bought the land from an old rancher, Mr. Henderson, whose family had owned the valley for a century. The only catch was the new upscale development that had sprung up on the adjacent parcel to the east, Whispering Pines Estates. We didn't think much of it. Our deed was clear, our property lines surveyed and staked. We were not, and had never been, part of their association. Our first week, a welcome basket appeared on our doorstep. It was filled with artisanal jams, locally baked bread, and a 3-inch thick binder ominously titled Whispering Pines Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. I chuckled, assuming it was a mistake. I tossed the binder onto a shelf in the garage, intending to return it, and forgot all about it. That was my first mistake. My second was underestimating the sheer, unbridled ambition of a bored woman with a title. My first official interaction with Karen, the self-appointed Queen of Whispering Pines, came about a month after we moved in. I was in the process of laying the foundation for the main tower, a complex grid of rebar and concrete that had to be perfect to support the immense weight and wind load. A pristine white Lexus SUV crunched to a halt at the end of my long gravel driveway, and a woman who perfectly matched the vehicle emerged. She was in her late 50s, wearing an expensive-looking pink tracksuit that seemed to be losing a battle with her frame. Her hair was a helmet of blonde spray, and her face was set in a mask of pleasant disapproval. "You must be Mr. Davies," she announced, not so much asking as stating a fact she'd already confirmed. She didn't offer a hand, just a critical gaze that swept over my work boots, my dusty jeans, and the half-finished concrete forms. "I'm Karen Miller, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." I wiped my hands on a rag and gave her a polite nod. "John, nice to meet you. Can I help you with something?" "I certainly hope so," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We've received some complaints from residents about the construction." She gestured vaguely at the organized chaos of my project site. "According to the CC and RS, all external structures, including foundations for recreational equipment, require pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee." I felt a slow, creeping sense of dread. "Karen, I appreciate you stopping by, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. My property isn't in your HOA." Her smile tightened. "A common misconception. The original plat for Whispering Pines included provisions for phased expansion. Your lot falls under Phase 4. It's an administrative matter, really. The paperwork is just catching up. In the meantime, all residents are expected to adhere to the community standards." She said community standards like it was a sacred text. I kept my tone level. "I have a copy of my deed in the official county plat map. It shows my parcel number 207 as separate and distinct from the Whispering Pines subdivision. There are no covenants or HOA obligations attached to my title." I might as well have been speaking another language. She simply waved a dismissive hand. "Lawyers and their paperwork. So confusing. The reality on the ground is what matters. And the reality is, your project is not in harmony with the aesthetic of the community." She then handed me a crisp envelope. Inside was an official-looking letter, complete with the Whispering Pines logo, informing me that I was in violation of 3 different covenants and was being fined $50 a day until the unauthorized construction was halted and removed. I stared at the letter, then back at her. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. "You can't fine me," I said, the words coming out flat and hard. "You have no jurisdiction here." "Oh, I can," she purred. "And I will. The fines will accrue, and if they go unpaid, we will place a lien on your property. I'd hate for it to come to that." She turned and walked back to her Lexus, leaving me standing there with the ridiculous piece of paper in my hand. Sarah was furious when I told her that evening. "A lien? Can she do that?" she asked, her hands clenched on the kitchen counter. "No," I said, spreading my deed, the survey, and the county map across the table. "Legally, she's got nothing. This letter is toilet paper, but that doesn't mean she won't try." I spent the next day at the county records office, just to be absolutely certain. The clerk, a helpful woman named Mary, pulled up every document related to my parcel in the Whispering Pines development. It was exactly as I thought. My land was zoned as rural residential, completely independent. There was no Phase 4. There was no preliminary annexation survey. Karen had invented it all. That afternoon, I drafted a formal letter. I cited the specific public records, attached copies of my deed and the official plat map, and respectfully informed Ms. Miller that her authority ended at my property line and that any further attempts to fine me, harass me, or enter my property would be reported to the sheriff. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested. The little green card came back a week later, signed by Karen herself. The fines stopped. The letters stopped. For a few glorious months, there was silence. I thought I had won. I thought reason and documentation had prevailed. I went back to work on my array, pouring the concrete, assembling the first tower sections, and beginning the painstaking process of running the hundreds of copper-ground radials. The structure began to take shape, a testament to precision and power rising against the backdrop of the mountains. I didn't realize that I hadn't won. I had just wounded her pride, and for a person like Karen, a wounded ego is a far more dangerous thing than a legal defeat. I had proven her wrong, publicly and with evidence. In her world, that was an unforgivable sin. Her silence wasn't a retreat, it was a regroup. She wasn't giving up. She was just figuring out a new angle of attack. The quiet was the most dangerous part of all. It was the calm before she decided to escalate from bureaucratic nonsense to outright criminal destruction. And my fatal error was believing that the law on its own was enough to protect me. I learned the hard way that against someone who doesn't respect the law, you need more than paper. You need proof. You need leverage. And I was about to get a very expensive, very infuriating lesson in why you should always be prepared for the worst. The relative peace lasted through the spring and into the early summer. The main tower was up, a gleaming 100-foot spire of galvanized steel. I had just finished installing the rotator and the primary Yagi antenna, a massive multi-element beam that looked like a metallic fish skeleton pointed at the sky. It was a thing of beauty. I could already hear the faint crackle of distant conversations in my head, the thrill of making a contact with a fellow enthusiast in Japan or Australia from my little corner of Montana. The project was my sanctuary, a place where physics and patience came together. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of Karen's white Lexus parked at the edge of the HOA property, just sitting there. Other times I'd see her walking her little poodle along the boundary line, her eyes fixed on my tower. It was unnerving. One Saturday, Mr. Henderson, the old rancher I'd bought the land from, stopped by while I was tensioning the guy wires. He was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of his 80 years under the Montana sun. He leaned against his dusty pickup, chewing on a piece of hay. "That Karen giving you trouble?" he asked, nodding towards the Whispering Pines entrance. I recounted the story of the fines in the certified letter. He just grunted. "Figured as much. She tried the same thing with me when they first built this place. Tried to tell me my barn was an unapproved agricultural structure and that my cattle were a livestock nuisance. My family's been running cattle on this land since before her grandparents were born." "What did you do?" I asked. "I told her if I saw her or any of her people on my side of the fence again, I'd introduce them to my 12-gauge and a bag of rock salt," he said with a grim smile. "She's all bluff and bluster, but she's got a mean streak. She sees something she wants or something she doesn't like, and she thinks the rules are just suggestions for other people. Watch your back with that one, son. She doesn't forget a slight." His warning stuck with me. Karen hadn't forgotten. She was waiting. A few weeks later, the second wave of her attack began, this time more insidious. I received a notice from the County Planning and Zoning Department. A formal complaint had been filed against my property, alleging that my antenna tower violated height restrictions and was an unpermitted commercial structure. The complaint was anonymous, but I knew. I had to take a day off work, gather my permits, which I had meticulously secured months before construction even began, and go down to the county office to clear my name. The zoning officer was apologetic. "Everything's in order here, Mr. Davies. Your permit is valid. You're well within the height allowance for your zoning class. This is clearly a nuisance complaint." But the damage was done. It was a day of my time, a spike in my blood pressure, and a clear message from Karen. I can still make your life difficult. 2 weeks after that, a truck from the state's Department of Environmental Quality showed up. Another anonymous complaint, this time alleging I was bearing hazardous materials on my property. The two inspectors were polite but firm. They had to investigate. They spent 4 hours walking my property, looking at my neatly organized materials, the empty containers of concrete sealant, the coils of new wire. They found nothing, of course. They left, shaking their heads. "Looks like someone's got it in for you," one of them said as they drove away. That was the tipping point. She was using government agencies as a form of harassment. This was no longer a simple dispute. It was a campaign. I had documented everything. The letters, the visits, the certified mail, the dates and times of the frivolous complaints. But I realized I needed more. I needed to see what was happening when I wasn't looking. That evening, I sat down at my computer and began designing a different kind of project. My career in the Signal Corps wasn't just about antennas. It was about intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. I knew the technology. I ordered 4 high-resolution, weatherproof cameras with night vision and motion detection capabilities. I bought a dedicated server and enough hard drive space to store months of continuous footage. I planned the installation with military precision. One camera was mounted high on the tower itself, giving me a bird's-eye view of the entire 10 acres. A second was concealed in a birdhouse near the main gate, capturing every vehicle that came or went. A third was hidden in the dense woods along the property line I shared with the HOA. The fourth, and most important, was disguised as a rock and placed just a few feet from the base of my antenna array with a perfect close-up view of the tower legs and the concrete pad. I linked them all to a secure network, accessible from my phone. The system would send me an instant alert, complete with a live video feed, if any motion was detected in a designated zone. It was expensive. It was time-consuming. Sarah thought I was being paranoid. "Are you sure this is necessary, John? It feels like you're building a fortress." "A fortress is a defensive structure, honey," I told her, crimping a network cable. "This is a tripwire. She's already proven she's willing to lie and abuse the system. I need to know what her next move is before she makes it. I'm not going to let her win by attrition." I finished the installation on a Sunday afternoon. I tested the system, watched the crisp, clear video stream to my phone, and felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait. I didn't have to wait long. The alert on my phone went off 3 days later on a Wednesday morning. I was in town picking up a special order of ferret cores from the electronics supply store. The notification popped up. "Motion detected, tower base." My stomach twisted into a knot. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking slightly as I opened the app. The live feed filled my screen, and there she was, Karen. She was standing on my concrete pad, pointing at my tower. With her were 2 rough-looking men in greasy overalls. Behind them, parked just off my driveway, was a battered-looking flatbed truck with a crane and a rusty, oversized set of cutting torches. A logo on the truck door read, "Miller and Son Scrap Metal." My blood ran cold. Miller. It was her family. She wasn't just directing this. It was a family operation. I watched, my breath caught in my throat, as one of the men sparked the torch. The brilliant, terrible blue-white flame hissed to life. He knelt down and placed the tip of the torch against the thick, galvanized steel of the first tower leg. I couldn't hear the sound, but I could see the shower of orange sparks, the cherry-red glow of the metal as it began to yield. They were cutting it down. They were cutting down my tower. My first instinct was to race back, to confront them, to physically stop them. But my training kicked in. Don't engage the enemy on their terms. Observe, document, let them walk deeper into the trap. I hit the record button on my phone, saving the live stream directly to the cloud. I watched as Karen gestured impatiently as the men worked with brutal efficiency, cutting through each of the 4 main support legs. I watched as they attached a chain from the crane to the top of the tower. I watched the magnificent structure that I had built with my own hands groan, tilt, and then crash to the earth with a silent, sickening finality. My heart broke, but through the anger, a cold, hard resolve began to form. She was smiling. On the video feed, I could see her smiling, a triumphant, vicious little smirk. She thought she had won. She had no idea she had just handed me the keys to her own destruction, all recorded in glorious 1080p. The drive back to my property was the longest 15 minutes of my life. A storm of emotions raged inside me, white-hot fury, a profound sense of violation, and beneath it all, a chilling, razor-sharp focus. I didn't speed. I didn't race. I drove the speed limit, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My mind was already working, processing, planning. The live feed had cut out shortly after the tower fell, likely when they started cutting it into smaller, more manageable pieces, and severing the camera's power line in the process. But it didn't matter. I had the crucial footage. I had her on my property, directing the destruction. I had the truck, the company name, the faces of the men. I had everything. When I turned onto my driveway, they were gone. The silence was deafening. Where my tower had once soared, there was now only a void against the sky. The ground was a scene of industrial carnage. The concrete pad was scarred, the earth torn up. They had been brutally efficient, like vultures stripping a carcass. They had taken everything: the tower sections, the antennas, the miles of copper wire from the ground radial system that they had ripped from the earth with the truck's crane. It was all gone. I walked the perimeter, my phone recording a slow, steady video of the devastation. I documented every cut, every gouge in the ground, every footprint in the soft dirt. This was no longer a civil matter. This was a crime scene. My next call was not to a lawyer, it was to 911. I reported a trespass and the theft of over $100,000 worth of property. The dispatcher sounded skeptical at first, probably used to minor neighborhood squabbles. But the dollar amount I quoted got her attention. "A deputy is on the way, sir." A half hour later, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. A young deputy, probably not much older than my own son, stepped out. His name tag read Miller. For a heart-stopping second, I thought he might be related to Karen. He had a cautious, slightly world-weary look. "You reported a theft, Mr. Davies?" I nodded, my face a grim mask. "Grand larceny, to be precise, and trespassing, and destruction of private property." I led him to the concrete pad and let the scene speak for itself. He whistled softly. "What was here?" "A 100-foot amateur radio antenna array," I explained, "valued at approximately $150,000 in materials and equipment." His eyebrows shot up. "And you think you know who did it?" "I don't think," I said, pulling out my phone. "I know." I showed him the video. I showed him Karen Miller, in her pink tracksuit, pointing and directing the two men. I showed him the cutting torch, the truck with the Miller & Son scrap metal logo, the moment the tower fell. I zoomed in on her triumphant smirk. The deputy's entire demeanor shifted. The cautious skepticism vanished, replaced by a focused intensity. He watched the footage 3 times. "Is she the president of that HOA next door?" he asked. "She is," I confirmed. He let out a long, slow breath. "We've had, dealings with her before. Nothing on this scale, though. Usually just arguments over lawn ornaments." He looked around at the damage again. "This is a felony, no question." He spent the next hour taking my official statement, photographing the scene, and collecting the video files as evidence. As he was getting ready to leave, I asked the question that had been nagging at me. "Your name is Miller. Any relation?" He gave me a wry, tired smile. "Distant cousin. My side of the family doesn't talk to her side. Now I've got a pretty good idea why. Don't worry, Mr. Davies. I'm not letting family get in the way of this. This is as clear-cut a case of grand larceny as I've ever seen." He promised to go and question Karen and the scrap metal company immediately. I knew what was coming. She would lie. She would produce her fake documents, her fabricated story about the annexation. She would try to frame this as a legitimate HOA action, and a part of me was counting on it. Every lie she told the police would be another charge, another nail in her coffin. After the deputy left, I called Sarah. I told her what had happened. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then a shaky breath. "Oh, John, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," I told her, the cold resolve in my voice surprising even myself. "Be ready. This is where it gets serious." My final call of the day was to a man named David Chen. He was a young, hungry lawyer whose father had served in my unit years ago. I'd helped David with some scholarship applications when he was heading to law school. He just opened his own practice and specialized in property law. He owed me a favor, and he was ex-military, an Army JAG officer. He understood chain of command, the importance of evidence, and the strategic application of force. I laid out the whole story for him, from the first welcome basket to the empty space where my tower used to be. I told him about the cameras, the footage, the police report. He was silent for a long moment when I finished. Then he said, John, she hasn't just committed a felony. She's opened herself and the entire HOA up to a world of civil liability. This is not just a slam dunk case. This is a legal masterpiece of self-destruction. She handed you a signed confession on a silver platter. What's our first move? I asked. We let the criminal case proceed, David said, his voice humming with energy. While the DA is building their case against her for larceny and fraud, we go after the money. We will sue her personally, we will sue her scrap metal company, and we will sue the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, its board of directors, and their insurance company. We are going to make this so painful for them that they will have no choice but to pay for every cent of damage, plus punitive damages for the sheer malice involved. He paused. She thought she was tearing down an eyesore, John. By the time we're done, she's going to wish she'd bought you a gold-plated welcome sign instead. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my office, the blueprints for my fallen towers spread out on the desk in front of me. I wasn't looking at them with sadness anymore. I was looking at them as Exhibit A. The battle was no longer about a tower. It was about principle. It was about sending a message that you cannot just take what isn't yours, that you cannot bully people into submission with fake rules and petty abuses of power. Karen had started a war of attrition. Now I was going to wage a war of annihilation. The next morning, David Chen was in my driveway before the sun had fully crested the mountains. He was sharp, dressed in a suit that looked a little too expensive for a new practice, and he carried a briefcase that seemed to contain the focused energy of a small nuclear reactor. He had the same intensity I'd seen in young lieutenants who were eager to prove themselves, but it was tempered with the cold calculation of a lawyer. We sat at my kitchen table, which was now my command center. It was covered in documents. My deed, the plat maps, the original HOA covenants I dug out of the garage, copies of my certified letters, the police report, and a hard drive containing the surveillance footage. Okay, David began, foregoing any pleasantries. The deputy called me this morning. He paid a visit to Karen Miller last night. She played it exactly as we predicted. He pulled out a notepad. She claimed you were a problematic resident in violation of numerous covenants. She produced a document, supposedly a resolution from the HOA board, authorizing the abatement of the unapproved structure. She claimed the scrap metal company was hired by the HOA and that the scrap value of the materials would be credited against the fines you owed. The document is a forgery, obviously, I stated. Obviously, David confirmed with a thin smile. The deputy is getting a warrant for the HOA's official records to compare the signature and format. But her lie is now on a police report. That's obstruction of justice and filing a false report, on top of the larceny. She's doing our work for us. He then laid out the plan of attack, a multi-front war. Front 1, the criminal case. The DA's office will handle this, but we will provide them with every piece of evidence we have. Your testimony, the videos, the financial records for the cost of the array. We want a conviction. Front 2, the civil suit. This is where we apply the pain. We're filing a suit with 5 defendants, Karen Miller personally, Miller and Son Scrap Metal, and the Whispering Pines HOA, its board of directors as individuals, and their insurance carrier. Sarah, who had been listening quietly, looked concerned. The whole board? Some of them might not have even known. That's the point, David explained, his tone firm but patient. They have a fiduciary duty to oversee the HOA's actions and finances. They allowed Karen to run wild. Their negligence makes them liable. When they get served with a lawsuit that could bankrupt them personally, their loyalty to Karen will evaporate. We're not just fighting Karen, we're dismantling her power base. Front 3, he continued, is information warfare. Karen controls the narrative inside the HOA. We need to break that control. This was the part that resonated most with my own background. It wasn't just about winning in court, it was about winning the hearts and minds. How do we do that? I asked. We start by talking to your neighbors, not just in the HOA, but the other landowners around it, like your friend Mr. Henderson. We gather stories. Karen has been in power for 5 years. I guarantee you are not the first person she has bullied. We find a pattern of abuse. We build a coalition. That afternoon, I paid a visit to Mr. Henderson. I told him the whole story and showed him the video on my phone. He watched it, his expression hardening. When the tower fell, he let out a low curse. I knew she was mean, but I didn't think she was a common thief, he said, shaking his head. That woman's got poison in her soul. The lawyer thinks she's done this to other people, I said. Do you know anyone? He thought for a moment, stroking his chin. The Garcias at the end of the main road. She made them rip out a beautiful rose garden their daughter planted because the colors weren't on the approved palette. Fine them into the ground until they complied. And the Wilsons, a young military family, had a small flagpole with an American flag. She said it violated the height rules and forced them to take it down. Broke that young man's heart. He gave me their addresses. You go talk to them. You tell them old man Henderson sent you. You tell them it's time someone finally stood up to that witch. Over the next week, Sarah and I began a quiet campaign. We visited the Garcias, a kind elderly couple who were still heartbroken over their garden. We talked to the Wilsons, who were initially hesitant to speak out, afraid of repercussions. But when I, a fellow veteran, showed them the evidence of what Karen had done to me, their fear turned to anger. The stories started pouring out. A family forced to repaint their house because the shade of beige was one digit off the approved code. A man fined for working on his classic car in his own garage with the door open. A woman told her children's swing set was a visual nuisance. It was a pattern of petty tyranny, of one person using a tiny amount of power to make life miserable for everyone else. David, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of legal action. He filed the lawsuit. He got a court order to depose Karen and the other board members. He subpoenaed the records for Miller and Son scrap metal, looking for the bill of sale for my tower. We discovered the company was owned by Karen's brother-in-law and that they had chopped up my custom array and sold it for a measly $5,000 in scrap metal. The check had been made out not to the HOA, but to Karen Miller personally. It was the smoking gun. She hadn't just removed a violation. She had hired her family to steal my property so she could pocket the cash. The case was no longer just about property destruction. It was about fraud and embezzlement. The board members, when served with the lawsuit, reacted exactly as David had predicted. Panic. They called an emergency closed-door meeting, which, according to a sympathetic board member who had grown tired of Karen's antics, devolved into a screaming match. They demanded to see the annexation paperwork and the board resolution Karen had shown the police. Of course, she couldn't produce them because they didn't exist. Her power base was crumbling, not from an outside attack, but from the rot within. She had built her kingdom on lies, and now the foundation was giving way. We were still a long way from the finish line, but for the first time I felt the tide begin to turn. This was no longer just my fight. It was a fight for the Garcia's garden, for the Wilsons' flag, for every single person who had been bullied into silence. Karen thought she was swatting a fly. She had no idea she had disturbed a hornet's nest. The deposition was held in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm downtown. It was the first time I had seen Karen in person since the day she trespassed on my property to deliver her first bogus fine. She sat across the long, polished table, flanked by a harried-looking lawyer provided by the HOA's insurance company. She was wearing a navy blue power suit, but she couldn't hide the nervous tremor in her hand as she adjusted her water glass. She tried to project an aura of authority, but her eyes darted around the room, unable to meet my steady gaze. David Chen was in his element. He was calm, methodical, his questions precise and relentless. He started by establishing the basics, getting her to confirm her position as HOA president, her duties, her authority. She puffed up, her voice regaining some of its familiar condescension as she described her role as the guardian of property values and community aesthetics. Then David produced the first exhibit, a certified copy of my property deed. Ms. Miller, could you please read the parcel number listed on this deed? She squinted at it. Parcel 207. And now, David said, sliding another document across the table, this is the official plat map for the Whispering Pines Estate subdivision, filed with Gallatin County. Could you please locate parcel 207 on this map? She scanned the map, her face growing tighter. She looked for a full minute, her finger tracing the boundaries. It's not on this map. Exactly, David said, his voice flat. Because it is not and has never been part of your subdivision. Is that correct? Her lawyer interjected, "Objection. Calls for a legal conclusion." "It's a factual question, counsel," David shot back. "Ms. Miller, is my client's property within the boundaries shown on the official plat map of the community you preside over?" "No," she finally mumbled, the word barely audible. "But there were plans for annexation." "Plans which exist where, Miss Miller?" David pressed. "Can you show me a single email, a single letter, a single county filing that mentions the annexation of Parcel 207? She sputtered. "It was in the preliminary stages." "Verbal discussions?" "Verbal discussions with whom?" She couldn't name a single person. Her lie was collapsing under the slightest pressure. David then moved on to the day of the theft. He had the surveillance video queued up on a large monitor. "Ms. Miller, do you recognize the woman in this video?" He hit play. The footage showed her, clear as day, standing on my property. "That's me," she admitted, her voice thin. "And what are you doing here, on property that you just admitted is not part of your HOA?" "I was overseeing the abatement of a covenant violation," she insisted, clinging to her script. "Under whose authority?" "The board's authority." David slid another document across the table. It was a sworn affidavit from every other member of the HOA board, each one stating that they had never discussed, seen, or approved any resolution to remove a structure from my property. Several of them also stated that Karen had explicitly told them I was a delinquent member of the association, and that the removal action was routine. Her face went pale. She stared at the signatures of the people who had been her loyal subjects, now all aligned against her. She was alone. "They're lying," she whispered. "They were all there at the meeting." "What meeting, Ms. Miller?" David asked softly. "Can you produce minutes from this meeting? Any record at all?" Silence. The final blow came when David produced the bank records. A copy of the check from Miller and Sons Scrap Metal, made out to Karen Miller, personally, and a copy of her bank statement showing the $5,000 deposit the following day. "Ms. Miller," David said, his voice dripping with contempt, "the HOA covenants you claim to hold so sacred require all funds, fees, and credits to be deposited into the official HOA bank account. Can you explain why you deposited the proceeds from the sale of my client's stolen property into your personal checking account?" She stared at the papers as if they were snakes. Her lawyer put his head in his hands. She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say. She had been caught red-handed in a cheap, grubby little scheme. She wasn't a community guardian. She was a common thief who had used her position to enrich herself by a paltry $5,000. Causing $150,000 in damages in the process. The deposition was a slaughter. By the time it was over, the insurance company's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. He pulled David aside in the hallway. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw the lawyer's panicked expression and David's grim, uncompromising nods. A few days later, we got the first offer from the insurance company. $75,000. A lowball, an attempt to see if we were serious. David's response was a single sentence sent via email. "Our next communication will be a motion for summary judgment, and we will be adding a RECO charge to the civil suit." The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was a legal sledgehammer designed to dismantle criminal enterprises. Applying it to an HOA president was an aggressive, almost unheard-of move. But David argued that Karen's pattern of using the HOA for personal gain, involving her family's business, and committing fraud constituted a racketeering enterprise in miniature. It was a bold legal gambit, and it terrified the insurance company. Their entire business model is based on avoiding unpredictable, high-cost litigation. A RICO case was their worst nightmare. Their second offer came 2 days later. It was for the full $150,000 to replace the array, plus another $50,000 for punitive damages and legal fees, and a formal public apology from the HOA. There was one more condition, one that I had insisted on. It was non-negotiable. Karen Miller had to resign as president and be permanently barred from ever serving on an HOA board in the state of Montana again. We were getting close. The money was one thing, but the real victory would be stripping her of the power she so desperately craved. The community rebellion I had helped stoke was also reaching a boiling point. The affidavits from the board members had circulated among the homeowners. The story of her embezzling the scrap money had spread like wildfire. People were furious. They felt betrayed and foolish. They had allowed this woman to rule their lives, and she had been using them and their money for her own petty crusades and personal profit. A petition was being circulated to force a special meeting to recall her. The signatures were piling up. Karen was trapped. The legal walls were closing in. The criminal charges were pending, and her own community was turning on her. She had nowhere to run. Her reign of terror over Whispering Pines was about to come to a very public and very humiliating end. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday night in the community clubhouse, a building Karen had lorded over like it was her personal palace. The air inside was electric with tension. It was standing room only, packed with over 100 angry homeowners. The Garcias were there. The Wilsons were there, wearing a small American flag pin on their jackets. Mr. Henderson had even come, standing in the back, his arms crossed over his chest, a silent observer to the proceedings. I was there with David, and at David's suggestion, we had tipped off a local news station. A reporter and a cameraman were setting up discreetly in the corner. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about public accountability. Karen sat at the head table with the 4 other board members. They had positioned their chairs to be physically as far away from her as possible. She looked haggard. Her helmet of hair was slightly askew, and her face was puffy and pale. She banged a gavel on the table, the sound startlingly loud in the tense silence. "This meeting of the Whispering Pines HOA is now in order," she began, her voice trying for its usual imperious tone, but cracking under the strain. The first item on the agenda. A man in the front row, the one who'd been fined for working on his classic car, shot to his feet. "The first item on the agenda is your resignation, Karen." A chorus of angry agreement erupted through the room. "We have a petition with signatures from 70% of the homeowners demanding your immediate recall," another woman shouted. Karen's face flushed a blotchy red. "That is not proper procedure. There are bylaws that must be followed." David chose that moment to stand up. He was the calm center of the storm. "Ms. Miller, perhaps we can dispense with the formalities. My client, Mr. John Davies, is here, and he has a very generous offer to settle the lawsuit filed against you in this association." All eyes turned to me. The room went quiet. Karen glared at David. "This is a private HOA matter. You have no standing here." "Oh, I think I do," David said coolly. "Considering my client is about to own this HOA if you don't accept our terms. The insurance company has agreed to pay for the damages you caused, but our settlement has one final, non-negotiable condition." He let the words hang in the air. "Your immediate and permanent resignation from this board and any future HOA board." The room exploded in applause and cheers. "Resign, resign, resign," they chanted. Karen looked cornered, her eyes darting from the angry faces in the crowd to the stoic expressions of her fellow board members. She saw no allies. No one was coming to her rescue. Her entire world was collapsing in on her. "This is a conspiracy," she shrieked, her voice a shrill, desperate cry. "He's a troublemaker who moved in and broke all the rules. I was protecting our property values. I was doing my job." I stood up then, for the first time. I hadn't planned to speak, but I couldn't let that lie stand. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the suddenly silent room. "You didn't do your job, Karen. You committed a crime. You trespassed on my land, you destroyed my property, and you stole from me. You didn't protect property values. You exposed this entire community to millions of dollars in legal liability because of your arrogance and your greed." I looked around at the faces in the crowd. "You didn't just hurt me. You hurt the Garcias, who loved their garden. You hurt the Wilsons, who just wanted to fly their country's flag. You bullied and fined and harassed good people because it made you feel powerful. Your power is gone, Karen. The only question now is whether you walk out of here with a shred of dignity, or if we have to take that from you, too." As if on cue, the main doors to the clubhouse swung open. 2 sheriff's deputies stepped inside. One of them was the young Deputy Miller, who had taken my initial report. He held a warrant in his hand. "Karen Miller," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "you are under arrest for the charges of grand larceny, felony destruction of property, and insurance fraud." A collective gasp went through the room. the news camera whirred to life, its red light a malevolent eye focused squarely on Karen. This was it, the symbolic final confrontation, the moment of absolute reversal. Karen stared at the deputies, her mouth hanging open. The color drained from her face, leaving it a pasty, doughy white. The fight went out of her completely. She seemed to shrink into her power suit, all the bluster and arrogance deflating like a cheap balloon. She didn't resist. She didn't say a word. She simply stood up, turned, and placed her hands behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent room. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Deputy Miller led her past the head table, past the rows of her former subjects, and out the door into the flashing blue and red lights of the waiting patrol car. No one said a word. They just watched as the woman who had terrorized their neighborhood was stripped of her power and her freedom in the most public way imaginable. The camera followed her all the way to the car, capturing the final, humiliating chapter of her reign. The door slammed shut, and the car pulled away, its lights painting fleeting streaks across the faces of the stunned homeowners. The queen was gone, the kingdom was free, and a profound, cathartic quiet settled over the room. The war was over. In the weeks that followed Karen's arrest, the Whispering Pines HOA underwent a radical transformation. The remaining 4 board members, thoroughly spooked by their near miss with financial ruin, resigned in unison. A special election was held. Mr. Henderson, despite not being a member, was asked by the grateful community to oversee the transition and help them elect a new, sensible board. He handpicked a few residents he knew to be level-headed, including the Wilsons and the Garcias, and they won in a landslide. The first act of the new board was to formally ratify the settlement agreement with me. The check from the insurance company arrived, covering the full replacement cost of my array and all associated damages. Their second act was to go through the 3-inch binder of covenants with a red pen. The petty, vindictive rules were slashed. The approved color palettes were abolished. The restrictions on gardens, flags, and swing sets were eliminated. They rewrote the bylaws to include term limits and strict oversight on spending, ensuring that no single person could ever accumulate the kind of unchecked power Karen had. They issued a formal public letter of apology to me and to all the residents who had been unfairly targeted over the years. It was published in the local paper. The community began to heal. People started talking to their neighbors again. A block party was held. Mrs. Garcia began planting a new rose garden, this time bigger and more colorful than before. The Wilsons installed a tall, proud flagpole next to their front door, and the American flag flew high over Whispering Pines. The change was palpable. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership and relief. Meanwhile, the legal system did its work. Faced with the mountain of evidence, the video, the forged documents, the bank records, the testimony of the entire HOA board, Karen had no choice. On the advice of her public defender, she pleaded guilty to felony grand larceny and fraud. Her plea deal spared her a long prison sentence, but she was sentenced to 5 years of probation, 2,000 hours of community service, and was ordered to pay full restitution. Since the insurance company had already paid me, her restitution was to them. They placed liens on her house, her Lexus, and any other assets she had. She lost everything. Her house in the neighborhood she had so tyrannically ruled was sold to pay her debts. The last I heard, she was living in a small apartment on the other side of town, working a minimum wage job. She was stripped of her wealth, her status, and the power she craved more than anything. It was a fitting end. As for me, I got to work. With the settlement money, I started rebuilding. I hired a local engineering firm to help me fabricate new tower sections, stronger than the last. I ordered new antennas, new cable, new grounding systems. It was a massive undertaking, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just a hobby project anymore. It was a monument, a symbol of a fight won. Neighbors from the HOA would stop by, not to complain, but to offer help or just to watch the progress. Mr. Wilson, the young military man, spent a whole Saturday helping me run new coaxial cable. Mr. Garcia brought over a tray of his wife's tamales for the work crew. I was no longer the outsider. I was part of the community, a community that had been forged in the fire of a common struggle. The day the new tower was finally erected was a celebration. Sarah and I invited everyone, the new board members, the Wilsons, the Garcias, Mr. Henderson, David Chen, even Deputy Miller, who came by on his day off. We had a barbecue on my back lawn, right next to the gleaming new concrete pad. The new tower soared 120 feet into the clear Montana sky, 10 feet taller than the last one, a silent, defiant statement. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I went into my new, fully equipped radio shack. I powered up the transceivers. The static hissed, alive with the energy of the planet. I calibrated the rotator, turning the massive Yagi antenna eastward, toward the darkening horizon. I keyed the microphone. CQ, 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 I called out, the universal invitation for a conversation. This is Kilo 7 Juliet Delta Mike. Calling CQ and listening. A moment of silence and then a faint voice, laced with static, came back through the speaker. It was a man from a small town in rural Japan. We talked for 20 minutes about the weather, about our equipment, about our lives. It was a simple human connection, made possible by a miracle of physics and engineering that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and land. I leaned back in my chair, a deep sense of peace settling over me. The tower wasn't just metal and wire. It was a testament to the fact that you can't let bullies win. You have to stand your ground. You have to be patient, methodical, and relentless. Justice doesn't always come easy, but when it comes, it's as clear and strong as a radio signal on a perfect night, a signal that can bounce off the moon and travel to the farthest corners of the world. My property was safe, my rights were secured, and my little corner of Montana was finally truly home. The story didn't entirely end with Karen's conviction and my new tower. The ripples of her downfall continued to spread, creating a lasting legacy of change that I hadn't anticipated. The local news story about the HOA Queen's takedown went viral in a small-town sort of way. It was picked up by a few larger regional outlets and then found its way onto national forums and websites dedicated to HOA horror stories. My inbox, which I had listed in my ham radio contact information, began to fill with messages from people all over the country. They were from veterans, from retirees, from young families, all trapped in their own battles with overzealous, power-mad HOA boards. They shared stories that mirrored my own: absurd fines, threats of liens over trivial matters, and the feeling of being powerless against a bureaucratic tyrant. They weren't asking for money or legal help. They were asking for advice. They wanted to know how I did it. How did I fight back and win? I realized that my personal battle had become a case study. With David Chen's help, I put together a simple, step-by-step guide. We called it the Signal Core Strategy for HOA Disputes. It was based on the principles I had used. Document everything. Communicate formally. Know your governing documents better than they do. Build a coalition. Use their own rules against them. Never escalate to anger. Escalate with evidence. We turned it into a PDF, and I started emailing it to anyone who asked. It felt good to take a negative experience and turn it into a tool that could empower others. Sarah and I became unlikely local celebrities for a while. People would recognize me at the grocery store or the hardware store. "You're the antenna tower guy," they'd say, shaking my hand. They saw the story as a victory for the common person, a classic David and Goliath tale set in modern suburbia. The most significant change, however, was in the legal landscape. David Chen, buoyed by the high-profile win, became the go-to lawyer in the state for property rights cases against HOAs. The RICO threat he had used against Karen's insurance company became a legendary tactic among other lawyers. His aggressive, well-documented approach forced several other HOAs in the region to rethink their own heavy-handed enforcement policies. Insurance companies that underwrote HOA liability policies even started sending out memos, warning their clients against the kind of overreach that had cost them so dearly in my case. They began demanding better oversight and clearer documentation from the boards they insured. Our case had effectively put the entire HOA industry in the state on notice. One of my most satisfying follow-ups was with Miller and Son Scrap Metal. After Karen's conviction, her brother-in-law's business came under intense scrutiny. It turned out they had a long history of acquiring scrap metal under questionable circumstances. The publicity from my case led to other people coming forward with their own stories, and the state licensing board launched a full investigation. Their business license was suspended, and they were hit with massive fines for improper record-keeping and handling of stolen materials. They went bankrupt within a year. The entire corrupt little ecosystem that Karen had built around herself had been completely dismantled. Life on my 10 acres settled into a comfortable rhythm. I spent my days tinkering with my radio equipment, making contacts around the globe, and volunteering my services for the Regional Disaster Response Network. My array became a key communication hub for emergency drills, able to maintain contact when other systems failed. The tower was no longer a symbol of conflict. It was a tool for community service, which felt like the ultimate vindication. The new Whispering Pines board would occasionally consult me on technical matters or boundary questions, treating me as a respected neighbor rather than an adversary. The relationship between my independent parcel and the managed community next door became one of mutual respect. We coexisted peacefully, a model of how things should have been from the start. I kept in touch with David Chen, and we would occasionally meet for lunch. During one of these lunches about a year after the trial, he told me something that brought the story full circle. "You know," he said, stirring his iced tea, "the DA's office got a call from Karen's probation officer. Apparently, for her community service, they assigned her to litter cleanup along the county highways." I raised an eyebrow. And, he said with a grin, "her assigned route is the stretch of highway that runs right past Whispering Pines. 3 days a week, she's out there in a bright orange vest, picking up trash along the road, with a perfect view of your new tower." I couldn't help it. A slow smile spread across my face. I imagined her out there, in the hot sun or the bitter cold, stabbing at discarded fast food wrappers with a pointy stick. Every time she looked up, she would see it, taller, stronger, and more magnificent than the one she had destroyed. A silent, gleaming monument to her own spectacular failure. It wasn't about revenge. It was about irony. It was about the universe delivering a form of justice more perfect and poetic than any court of law could ever devise. She had called my masterpiece an unsightly scrap pile. Now her job was to pick up actual scrap, day after day, in the shadow of my victory. The satisfaction of that image was deeper and more lasting than any monetary settlement. It was the quiet, final note in a long and difficult symphony, a note of pure, unadulterated, and richly deserved poetic justice. My fight was well and truly over. I had won.